Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Command & Conquer Tiberian Sun for PC. This is a real-time strategy game developed by Westwood Studios and published by Electronic Arts in August of 1999, and it was to a pretty big amount of acclaim. People generally seem to like it quite a bit, and compared to the previous games, it wasn't quite as well received as Red Alert 1 was, but it was definitely a big release of its time. And it very clearly is on a different engine. It was released 3 years after the previous game in the series, so obviously they had a pretty big shift in technology by that point. And even though it is still a 2D game, it's on the engine that would also power Red Alert 2. So with the change in engine and the higher production values of this game compared to its predecessors, how did this one turn out? And more importantly, does it hold up to this day? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's definitely a pretty major step up over the previous game in the series, and it's to a pretty huge degree. This thing not only runs in modern resolutions with merely an INI tweak of what resolution you actually want to run it at, but also has higher res sprite work. It's a lot more detailed. The engine itself is designed to run at a much higher resolution than the previous two games were, so obviously, from there, it's going to be more detailed. And the amount of detail they did pack into pretty much everything is leagues ahead of what you saw in the original Command & Conquer and, of course, Red Alert. Though, admittedly, even when this thing came out, it wasn't particularly impressive as far as its visuals go. We had better-looking 2D strategy games by that point. So, unfortunately, this thing ended up looking kind of average for its time. And while it still holds up better than the previous games in the series, it's definitely aged pretty considerably, although the ability to run it at a modern resolution makes it so much better. As far as the rest of the presentation goes, it still uses the FMV cutscene style that you had in the previous two games, but the production values are considerably better, so even though the visual quality of those FMV cutscenes is not necessarily all that great because it was on late 90s formatting, you had better CGI, you had big-name actors in this one, like Michael Biehn playing the character of McNeil for the GDI, as well as James Earl Jones as the chief officer of the GDI. So you had some pretty big names working with this, and they do a very, very good job in this game, actually. And not only that, but the rest of the cast performs pretty admirably too. For example, once again, Joseph Kakan reprises his role as Kane, and he portrays the role even better than he did in the original Command & Conquer. So all of that is very well appreciated, even though some of the acting is still kind of corny. But then there's the sound design, where the sound effects are better than the previous two games, and even though that doesn't say a whole lot, they're still better. And it also really helps that the soundtrack is just as good as ever. This time around, they went with something a bit darker and a bit more techno-inspired, partly because this is actually set in the future, as opposed to the previous game, the original Command & Conquer, which was set in roughly modern day. So it's actually kind of interesting that this thing also kind of has its own identity musically as far as the series goes, compared to, say, the original Red Alert, to the original Command & Conquer even, to the later games in the series as well. And the soundtrack is once again fantastic. There's a lot of groovy tracks in there that if you really wanted to, you could dance to them. And Klopacki did a great job of making it feel like it was in the same continuity as the original Command & Conquer soundtrack, while still making it have its own identity. So the presentation is just leagues ahead of the previous games, even though it has aged considerably by this point. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this actually continues the trend of the previous game in the series, Red Alert, in that it's actually a surprisingly dark game, even though it does have its lighter moments as well. In this one, it takes place many years after the events of the original Command & Conquer, where Tiberium has now spread all over the place, and it's basically a desperate attempt to just keep it in check as it completely devastates the ecosystems of the world. It's causing all sorts of these horrific storms, climate changes, creating deserts where there was once tons of life. it's a complete mess. And to make matters worse, people already knew that Tiberium is a very highly toxic substance, but now it's creating mutants. And that's creating a whole other problem in and of itself. And it's in this climate that the Brotherhood of Nod rises again. And under Kane's leadership, they go about trying to bring the growth of Tiberium to a ridiculous degree. And ultimately, their entire goal is just the complete destabilization of the world, and the GDI, the Global Defense Initiative, is trying to maintain order as best they can and fight off the Brotherhood of Nod before they can manage to basically destroy the world. And believe it or not, it's a surprisingly interesting plot. You don't expect a real-time strategy game, certainly not a Command and Conquer game at this point, to have an interesting plot, so it's kind of astounding that the plot manages to hold your interest. And it just goes to show you that their skills were improving as they produced these games. That said, the plot itself still has numerous problems with it, and most of those stem from it being a real-time strategy game. It just is not a good vehicle for telling a good story, and they certainly had not figured out how to do that at this point. So it ends up coming across as a bit stilted and awkward at times, and there's still some amateurish stuff going on here, so you will notice on occasion that the plot just kind of goes all over the place. But it's more interesting than anything in the prior Command and Conquer games, that is for certain. And the plot is actually extended by the Firestorm expansion, where in the aftermath of the events of just plain Tiberian Sun, where GDI was basically trying to cobble itself back together and try to halt the spread of Tiberium, while the Brotherhood of Nod was regrouping and looking for the AI known as Cabal, which is the voice that you actually hear when you are playing the game in the Nod side. It's that kind of harsh male voice that keeps telling you things like, unit ready, and all that. It's the AI that basically powers Nod. And so the first objective of the Nod campaign in Firestorm is to actually retake Cabal. And it turns out that Cabal goes rogue. And this creates the Firestorm crisis, which is the main plot of Tiberian Sun Firestorm. It's a surprisingly interesting plot once again. Although this one is a bit harder to sift through and feels like it was just kind of slapped together more. But it's still a pretty interesting idea, and it works surprisingly well given the constraints of this thing being a fairly early style of RTS. So, right off the bat, you've got a couple of plot lines that are kind of astounding in that they actually hold your interest throughout the game, even if they aren't particularly amazing. And you got a fairly dark tone to the game overall. There's a lot of just really grim stuff happening. And all of this blends together to make a pretty interesting setting for a video game. And that begs the question of what did they do with that setting in terms of gameplay? Well, it's basically a continuation from Command & Conquer Red Alert in that you have two different sides, the GDI and the Brotherhood of Nod. But in this particular case, they actually did a lot more to differentiate these two factions, where they each have quite a lot of units that the other side doesn't have. And once again, Nod tends to favor more of the stealth and speed approach, whereas the GDI is more of a conventional combined arms approach, where it relies more on force and Nod relies more on trickery. And they did a lot more to differentiate those playstyles by giving you more variation between the units. So even though you will have a few things that are the same across both factions, there's way more units that are very unique to one or the other. For example, both sides will get light infantry and engineers. That's not really unexpected. But beyond that, they pretty much have completely separate infantry. And then you get to their vehicles, and it's the same way. So it actually feels like you're playing different factions now, and this is greatly appreciated, given that in the previous game there was quite a bit of overlap, and it was really only differentiated in that the Soviets had more heavy armor stuff, and the Allies tended to have a lot more of combined arms gameplay. Whereas in this one, Each one has a very clear playstyle. And even though there isn't a lot of strategic depth to it, it's still running on the same ideas that powered, of course, the original Command & Conquer, Dune 2, and Red Alert, but it's definitely more than the previous games. And that is, of course, in no small part due to the differentiation between the factions. Now, it all still kind of boils down to just churning out a lot of units and charging in, but at least there's more variation in how you're going to churn out those units and charge in. You might do a much more sneaky approach if you're the Nod. You might do a good mixture of units if you're the GDI. You have plenty of options here, and that's what makes it a lot more compelling than the previous Command & Conquer games. It has more depth. Even though it's not a lot more depth, it's more depth, and that helps tremendously with this game's longevity. Even though it's a pretty simplistic game overall, it doesn't feel quite as archaic as the older games do. And that in and of itself makes it a lot easier to get into, even if you haven't played this series beforehand. So, what you'll find going into Tiberian Sun is that this plays like a fairly modern RTS. And even though it's incredibly simplistic and there's not really a lot of strategic depth to it, there's enough there to actually be able to enjoy the game properly. And it also helps that unit production is not anywhere near as sluggish as it was in the previous games, because they finally decided to add a unit queue. So you can now queue up units to produce. You'll still only produce one at a time, but now you can have lots of them planned in order to keep producing them automatically. So that goes quite a long way. And just the controls in general feel a lot more modern. That said, again, the game is very, very simplistic. And that's ultimately going to be the deciding factor on whether or not I can recommend this thing. Even though it's a very simplistic game, I did enjoy it in its time. In hindsight, it's actually pretty hard to get into it now. Mostly because I've just played a lot of RTSs, and so many RTSs are more complex and more interesting because of their complexities than this. This is the kind of game that I would jump into if I'm not feeling like taxing my brain but still kind of want to play an RTS. Or I would play it for the campaign. Skirmish mode, on the other hand, not so much. And that's another problem I had with the original Red Alert as well. It was just a mess to play in skirmish mode because of the AI. That's still a problem here as well. And you'll find that you'll probably get the most out of the campaigns rather than the skirmish mode. And if you're going to play something along the lines of skirmish mode, you'll probably want to play multiplayer, which is kind of a pain in the ass to get working these days. So that is a bit of a problem. So right there, you've pretty much lost one of the big draws of this game, which was just getting a bunch of buddies together and completely goofing around in this thing. Because that's what this game ultimately feels like. It's the game for you to just screw around in if you're not playing the campaigns. If you're playing the campaigns, you can actually play it for the plot, and it's surprisingly enjoyable in that sense. And the campaign structure itself is advanced from the previous game in the series, so it's definitely better than Command & Conquer Red Alert's campaign structures. And once again, you can play as the GDI or you can play as the Brotherhood of Nod. They each have their own separate campaigns, and there's quite a lot of content there. So you've got plenty of stuff in this game, right in the campaigns alone. But if you want to play the multiplayer, that's where a lot of the fun and just completely goofing off was. So if you can manage to find a group and actually get the multiplayer working, then you'll probably be able to play that and certainly enjoy it, even though there's not a lot of strategic depth to it. And the campaign is certainly enough to keep you interested, but the skirmish mode feels fairly lackluster. So all of this comes to the simple question of, do I recommend this game? Well, if you're already a fan of the Command & Conquer series and you're just going back and trying to find out what the older games are like, definitely. If you're looking at this thing from a historic standpoint, sure, why not? Because, let's face it, this is definitely a pretty strong piece of gaming history. But if you're wanting to go into this thing as an RTS, if you're just an RTS fan, I give a cautious recommendation. Because even though I enjoyed the game to some degree, like I said, that simplicity becomes a sticking point. So if you go into this thing and you're expecting something with actual strategic depth, you're going to be rather disappointed. If you're going into this thing expecting some really strong balancing, you're going to be disappointed. Even though units generally have counters that you can do. For example, infantry is weak against machine gun emplacements, sentry guns, things like that, whereas vehicles are weak against other vehicles and anti-vehicle infantry. It generally just comes down to how many units you just have. So the ceiling for strategies is not particularly high, and you're not really going to be able to find all that many strategies that actually work really well. And as a result, it's pretty hard to recommend to RTS fans on that basis. But if you're just looking for something to mess around with, if you're looking for an RTS that is just kind of the thing to sit back and not let your brain be taxed all that much, because you've played way too much of insert other really complicated RTS here, like, say, I don't know, Wargame European Escalation or something, well, then you might be able to get something out of it. But, again, it's a cautious recommendation. I can definitely recommend this game over all of the previous ones. Now, that may sound like heresy to some of you Red Alert fans out there, but keep in mind, the original Red Alert is archaic. And even looking back on it from a nostalgia standpoint, where I actually had that game back in the day, so I definitely know what I'm talking about from that perspective. But even looking back on it and taking the nostalgia into consideration, it's still really hard to go back to it. It's just too primitive. It's easier to go back to than the original Command & Conquer. But this is where the series truly became a modern RTS. And that makes it so much easier to go back to and play, because it feels right. It still stands on its own, even not as a historical game, even though it very clearly has aged considerably, and its simplicity can be problematic. Thanks for watching.